Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I'm giving myself a shorter break between actually clicking go live and when I start speaking, because I've noticed that my last couple of videos had like a 20-second gap between that. So I will be braver and start talking earlier than I usually do. Hello and welcome to a new stream. As I said the week before, I am back, so streams will be more regular, at least for a while. I don't have anything that time intensive that will now take up my time for the next month. So I'm happy to be going through Apple news, rumors, reviews, and whatever else we find. Like, please, if you feel like it, check out my latest video where I go through the Humane AI pin reviews, which are absolutely atrocious, which is fitting for an absolutely atrocious product. So yeah, there's quite a lot to cover in the world of tech, in the world of Apple. Granted, we are, as I said also in my last video, a lot of the stuff that we'll be doing for now is waiting until new iPads come out, and then waiting until WWDC comes around and we get like confirmation about iOS 18, new AI features, new versions of macOS, watchOS, etc. But then also across the board, we'll see new stuff throughout the year. Like, for example, best segue ever, we are getting supposedly M4 Max this year, later this year. So I suppose it's Q4, the way that Mark Gurman kind of put it. And they will be AI focused chips. We don't know if that just means that they will be from the ground up optimized for the kind of AI algorithms that will be part of iOS 18 and the latest version of macOS, or if that means that they will have a substantially faster neural engine. So there is a lot that we can discuss that isn't quite, like, oh, it's actually a new product that came out yesterday and reviews are out there, so please look into that, right? There's a lot of speculation, a lot of leaks and rumors, so this is the kind of coverage we'll have to deal with, at least for the next month or so. This will be a topic today. Another topic is another thing we're actually waiting for to become official, and that is the Snapdragon X Elite, which has obviously been announced now for months and months by Qualcomm. It's their M-series competitor that will be powering Windows laptops, I believe to a degree Android tablets, but the watch is just a little questionable if it's really suited for tablets. I'll explain why later. So we got more benchmarks for it, and I'll be going through several Mac benchmarks, power consumption metrics that we have data on for Mac, so to compare with what we already have for the Snapdragon X Elite. But of course, we'll have to wait until actual Snapdragon X Elite products before we fully can confirm, is this as fast as M2 or M3, in which way does it compare in terms of power efficiency, consumption, stuff like that. And before I start all of this, I want to give a quick shout out to James Atkinson on Twitter, a very, very good guy who is very interested in technology and everything Apple. I interact with him quite a lot, and he was instrumental in helping me compile quite a little bit of data concerning the Snapdragon X Elite and the AI capabilities of the latest Apple Silicon chips. Now, James, I apologize, I won't be using that much of what you have compiled for me, but I just wanted to give you a huge shout out. You are really, really awesome. And part of why I'm not using it is because I've looked into the X Elite. We quite honestly don't have enough AI benchmarks for it, certainly not AI benchmarks that are actually like cross-platform, easily available on M-series Macs. So the comparisons that I would be making would be, like, oh, it's 45 trillion operations per second versus the max 18, but is it FP16 or is it integer 8, right? And those are pretty meaningless metrics, and I will go into that as we talk more about the Snapdragon X Elite. But yeah, I'll be mostly focusing on CPU benchmarks, a little bit of GPU benchmarks, and then I hope we'll focus a lot more on AI stuff once we actually have the Snapdragon X Elite in some production ready products. And after that, I would especially love to see how it compares to M4 chips that supposedly will be more AI focused. And with this segue, with this presentation of the topics, I would actually like to make this my first topic today. Now, it's not a big one because there aren't a lot of details there, quite Mark Gurmany in that regard. But it is a very interesting topic because so much AI, basically everything, right? Leaks, rumors, speculation, a lot of crazy enthusiasm on the stock market. This has permeated tech society basically for 2-3 years now. Now, Apple has been making AI-enabled processors contrary to public opinion actually since the A11. Apple's first neural engine was inside the A11 processor that powered the iPhone X and the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, and specifically in the iPhone 10 it had the glorious task of powering the data behind Face ID, so that it actually has some AI-based understanding that your face could change a little bit. You can grow some facial hair, you can get a little thinner, a little thicker, right? And basically the AI there augments its basic understanding of your facial geometry with some realistic understandings of how humans might actually evolve a little bit, while still understanding that like our cheekbones are pretty much fixed in place until you do some plastic surgery, as is pretty much our nose structure. Yeah, this was basically Apple's first entry into AI. Then following that, the iPhone XS and XR had the A12 chip, which had a much more powerful neural engine. This is when Apple also started step by step with Core ML and other APIs exposing AI, or as how Apple called it back then, machine learning capabilities to developers. And then over time, they made those APIs better and they made those chips better, to the point that the A17 Pro currently processes 35 trillion operations per second, which we kind of speculate is an integer 8 metric or an FP16. We are not sure. It's very likely that it's integer 8, given that it's 2 times faster than the A16, but that was a 2x jump in 1 year, and it's not proven by benchmarks that are FP16 based, so it's probably an integer 8 metric. Again, thank you to James Atkinson for compiling a lot of that data. Feel free to actually ask him on Twitter what he believes is more accurate. So if you just want to compare trillion operations per second from one chip to the other, it especially stops making sense once you switch architectures, once you go from especially x86 to ARM, and especially once you also switch entirely the manufacturers. So even though it's both ARM based, Apple's silicon might perform very differently than the Qualcomm chip. So we'll wait for a lot of more benchmarks before we actually talk about hardcore hardware AI capabilities. However, this is supposedly, and we'll be getting back to the actual rumor here, according to Mark Gurman, this will be the focus of the M4 chips, and he suggests that we're actually getting a pretty comprehensive upgrade to the Apple Silicon lineup in late 2024. So similar to how we got basically 3 M3 chips in the MacBook Pro last year, he suggested we'll basically get something very similar for the M4 in late 2024 or around early 2025. What this suggests to me, one thing, is that Apple really targets now a 1-year upgrade cycle for Apple Silicon, similar to what they're doing with A-series chips for the iPhone. Now, I have always argued that if you have new hardware, please put it in, right? Yeah, every 6 months is way too fast. Every 9 months might be still a little too fast, because now you also risk maybe undercutting quality control and other stuff. However, once we get to 12 months and potentially like 13, 14, then I really say, yeah, if you actually have new hardware for a product after 12 months, please put it in, even if it's small upgrade. And then if you have newer hardware like 6 months later, you can still wait another like 3-4 months and then put it into another new product. No need to wait like 18 months before you put everything into one product. A lot of people speculated Apple might even switch to a full 2-year cycle. I think that just with how the industry works, with how the back to school season works, with how holiday seasons work, I just think that the general market wants new stuff. And if this rumor is correct, this would be basically an exact 1-year cycle from the M3 to the M4. So this is how the article basically also summarizes it by pointing out that M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max all came out in October. And this was basically Apple's fastest push ever for a new generation, having so many chips come out at once. And Mark Gurman saying we could see basically the same thing, but for M4, either late 2024, which would still put it like around October, November, and then throughout early 2025, we might see more stuff. And that is not unheard of. Obviously, we saw the same thing with like M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max might have all come out in October, but that was for the MacBook Pro, right? The MacBook Air and then the iMac were upgraded early this year. So we could see the same thing happening with M4, basically getting its major products. Basically, the MacBook Pro is probably now Apple's most successful laptop. It might sell less than the MacBook Air, but it probably has like higher margins on a higher price point. So this will be Apple's priority, at least in my opinion. And then everything else just follows throughout the year. iMac, MacBook Air, Mac Studio, and then of course the Mac Pro, which is kind of like the lowest priority level. So the iMac, low-end 14-inch MacBook Pro, high-end 14-inch MacBook Pro, 16-inch MacBook Pro, and Mac Mini machines will be updated with M4 chips first, which is interesting because apparently now the iMac is getting more priority. Maybe it just didn't sell well while being like a second removed stepchild somehow. The Mac Mini being updated to M4 is interesting. Maybe we will not see an M3 based Mac Mini. Maybe it just will switch very quickly to M4, and then we'll get the MacBook Air models, the Mac in spring 2025, the Mac Studio in mid 2025, and the Mac Pro later in 2025. Now, Mark Gurman said there will be at least 3 variants of the M4 chip, which is kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of not news, not rumors or anything. It's very likely that we're seeing M4, M4 Pro, M4 Max. And then the question is, will there be an M4 Ultra? We currently don't yet have an M3 Ultra. There are some rumors that we might not see an M3 Ultra, that supposedly like the Ultra Fusion interconnects were removed from the Max variants. I cannot speak to that as much as I love like Vadim Yurev from like Max Tech. Their predictions are a little bit too speculative for me. I do like making up hypotheticals, like what could happen, what is likely to happen, but I won't like base everything that I'm saying just on one guy that showed me some die shots that had the interposer or the Ultra Fusion interconnect removed. That's just not my kind of like prediction. To me, I actually think sounds pretty likely. I would also believe if Apple has like with Mac Pro coming out in later 2025, I would also believe that the M5 chip will not be an N3P chip, but that Apple would wait until 2 nanometer to make M5, because if the release schedule is still like somewhat staggered, like releasing an M5 that might be only like 5% better than M4 just from the node perspective doesn't really make that much sense. This is where I will say, like, yeah, even if 12 months have passed, I would still not really motivate a company to just make like a 5% better processor while everything else stays the same. With 2 nanometer around the corner, maybe the supply in late 2025 will not be there, but supply for 2 nanometer in early to mid 2026 definitely will be. And then I think that we would have like one generation that got like upgraded in 12 months, and then one in 18 months, and then maybe afterwards again one that got updated in 12 months to N2P. So basically 2 nanometer, but with backplane power delivery. I actually think that would be a really interesting schedule. Regardless, this is now my speculation, so this is more official. If you want to consider Mark Gurman like an official source, I know he of course is not one because he's still like a leaks and rumors guy, but yeah, this was interesting. This came out just after my last video. I believe the report came actually out while I was doing the live stream, but I only saw it right when I was finished. So Mark Gurman even liked my tweet where he said like, come on Mark, you basically like posted this right during my stream, couldn't you do it like an hour before? So there's that much else to consider. Like there are code names here: Donan for the low end, Brava for mid tier, Hydra for the top end. Usually I would expect Hydra to be written with a Y. Of course this just corresponds with M4, M4 Pro, M4 Max. Nothing too interesting there. The Hydra chip is designed for Mac Pro, which suggests it is either an ultra or an extreme tier chip. I still don't know when we'll ever see like an extreme chip. It's really like weird with as you know, ultra is where 2 max dies are combined into one chip, and extreme was the long rumored chip that would combine 4 max dies into one processor. This didn't happen yet. Let's see if it happens with the M4 generation or the M5. I kind of believe that if Apple ever wants the Mac Pro to be relevant again, it has to be the only device where you get like extreme chips. I would then believe that the Mac Studio would be basically the perfect place for ultra chips. The laptops, the MacBook Pro would be the perfect chips for Pro and Max chips, and then the MacBook Air and the iPads would be the perfect place for the base M series chip. I think this would be a very clean lineup. Then the iMac and the Mac Mini could get some in between like the base processors and the Pro processors. So I think this would be a very, very versatile lineup. Supposedly we could get as much as 512 gigabytes of unified memory. Depends a little bit on how many dies they actually connect into like an ultra variant. It depends on like the next generation of memory. If there's like higher density variants coming for LPDDR5X, Apple currently uses just like regular LPDDR5, which is 6400 megatransfers. They could then switch to like 8500 or 9600 megatransfers LPDDR5X or 5T memory, and maybe there will be like higher density variants for that. Again, this is now more speculative. I fully believe that the M4 generation will be a big step up in value. I fully believe that this is where we will stop getting 8 gigabytes of memory on MacBooks. Because you also have to consider Apple now has M3, like a 3 nanometer chip, right, powering the MacBook Air, and they can just perpetually make that MacBook Air cheaper and still offer you an 8 gigs of memory device with 256 gigabytes of storage. They can just put it into like the $9.99 territory, the $8.99 territory, or even the $7.99 territory, while they're like $11.99 and more expensive MacBooks that are actually like current would be getting like, in my speculation, 12 gigabytes of base RAM And then finally also 512 gigabytes of base storage. M4 will be using a 3nm process, however it will be the updated N3E versus N3B. N3E is both a mix of a little more efficient, a tiny bit denser, but it's also cheaper, so it's highly dependent on which like FinFlex variant of N3E is you actually use. So I know I've talked about that in the past. Maybe at some point we'll get to like a very detailed breakdown between the dies, if like M4 comes out and somebody actually compares like the density between N3E and N3B. But yeah, so it would be using a second generation 3nm process. However, you have to consider that that is not as big of an upgrade as, for example, N5P was over N5 or N7 Plus was over N7. This new node is primarily designed to have better yields and to allow for better pricing to basically third-party partners of TSMC. So there's both a lot and not so much, as in typical Mark Gurman fashion. Basically expect new Macs later this year, and expect them to be focused on AI. Now, he does not say what that actually means, if there will be like a very huge performance uplift there. There definitely will be built with like the AI algorithms in mind. It will be coming to iOS 18 and the latest version of macOS. It will be seeing like at WWDC. Sorry guys, I'm slowly starting to lose my voice, even though I didn't speak today. It's weird. So again, I cannot speak for how much faster it is. Maybe twice as fast as M3. Maybe it gets also like a newer like compute level by switching to like from FP16 to integer 8. And those computations, by the way, are not always like perfect 2x. So I'm not an expert in this, so I don't want to promise you any numbers here. Again, I will be trying to break down like AI benchmarks and AI claims, but we simply have to see the new chips, and then we'll have to see how they actually compare in benchmarks. Like we have like, I believe like one AI benchmark for the X Elite, and they couldn't find the same benchmark actually tested on Apple Silicon. It's quite a mess, honestly, with the AI world. Basically, if it's not NVIDIA and if it's not CUDA based, then it's kind of a mess when it comes to testing something. And of course, once you switch like operating systems, manufacturers, APIs, all of that becomes even more of a problem, because now you run into the issue of you're potentially not actually testing like the raw performance of a processor, but you're testing just how good is that benchmark actually optimized for that specific hardware, for that specific operating system, for that specific API. Is there potentially like a translation layer between the actual application and the processor? So there's a lot. But it is AI focused. So let's see if that just means that for one, I said two things, right, which would be AI focused, which would be like much faster neural engine and from the ground up optimized for neural algorithms. But you also have to consider that AI focus in today's market primarily means one thing, and that is marketing. So you will definitely see a lot of AI marketing from Apple in the second half of the year, once like iOS 18 comes around, once there's like a new iPhone that I'm sure will have like at least one exclusive AI feature for the A18 processors. I'm pretty sure the M4 will have like at least one AI exclusive feature versus M3, M2, M1. And then we'll also see how it gets like leveraged more and more by other applications. Like to anybody who like is interesting, like Photoshop has more AI stuff, including AI stuff that is like locally accelerated. The same goes for like DaVinci Resolve, which just announced a huge like update 19 version, which also has a ton of AI stuff. So if Apple basically wants, like, Apple stuff will be relevant with or or without AI marketing. But if they really want to like convince investors, if they really want to capitalize a little bit more on that AI train, they will have to advertise their stuff in a similar way. And I would also expect, like similar to what Mark Gurman actually pointed out in the past, that we would get like AI like improved versions of Xcode, of Final Cut Pro, and whatever else Apple has in mind, including like Pages, Keynote, Numbers, maybe some stuff that would work throughout every app automatically, and of course Siri would be improved. Maybe, who knows, maybe by this point they will like rename Siri because she's so much better supposedly. Maybe they would want to get rid of some of the stigma associated. And this is then when the marketing actually like goes into full force, when we get like not only the latest version of iOS and macOS, but when we also get like new iPhones, new Macs to actually take advantage of it. And I'm actually quite excited about it. I'm not one of those guys that believes that like, oh, AI will improve everything, it will change everything. But I do believe that AI will be a big part of improving most workflows. The more data-centric, I believe, the more instrumental AI will be. And I believe when it comes to more creative workflows, everything from like video production to even like drawing and stuff like that, I do believe that AI will also be helpful there. But I do believe that the the floor will still be very low, because if you are a dog shit artist, AI will like create stuff for you. It won't be your stuff. It will probably be like stolen from some other creator or something like that. So it won't actually make you a good or like a popular artist in any way. But if you already are talented and now you're using AI in some creative way, maybe you like double your output in some way with this, or maybe it allows you to put even more detail into everything else that you do. This is how I believe AI will actually transform a lot of workflows. Guys, I have no idea why I'm out of breath. You know me, I'm way better than this. Maybe I still haven't recovered from the workout that I did this morning. So I apologize if I'm a little bit like, that's really my fault. So the microphone is tuned as it always is. And I will be buying, by the way, one of those styrofoam covers that reduce like the impact of like noises from like my lips, my tongue, and my breathing. So this was basically the Mac stuff. Again, not quite a lot of detailed information. Thank you, Mark Gurman. But it is at least more stuff than we knew before. And it's very encouraging to think that Apple might actually be switching to like a 12-month schedule, at least whenever they actually have a new processor, right? Sometimes they might not have a finished processor every 12 months, and at that point I'm totally fine with them waiting a little bit. But if M4 is ready, why not give us a new Mac, right? Now, the next one, I would actually want to cover this first because it is a quick and dirty one, but it is a very positive one on its surface. However, I would want to give you some details about how it's specifically implemented right now, and that is with all the changes by the Digital Markets app and all the international pressure when it comes to regulations on the App Store and iOS in general. Apple has changed one of their long-standing guidelines and rules on the App Store and is now allowing retro game emulators, as they call them, on the App Store. This rule change actually came like out a week ago, and I was arguing with people on Twitter because from my reading of the rules, nothing prevented users from actually adding their ROMs to those emulator apps. And the first emulator that actually is coming out, I believe they call it iGBA. That one does support file import if you have like your own ROMs like stored in like the downloads folder in the Files app in general and stuff like that. It actually works really well, except for two things. First is the moral thing, that this is just a lazy copy of the open source project GBA for iOS. Now, I did call it stolen code when I when I first saw it, maybe I should take this back on Twitter, but basically GBA for iOS is open source. I don't know if that applies to like the entire design aesthetic and stuff like that. So Riley Testude, who is basically the most instrumental guy in the creation of like GBA for iOS, the Delta emulator, and of course that thing that allows you to sideload stuff onto your iOS devices, the Alt Store. I always forget what it's called. So he confirmed that the app was submitted without his participation or consent. Again, I don't know how much of the code actually can belong to him because it's open source, but I strongly believe, because like it takes like literally all the assets from the GBA for iOS app that I have known and used for years, that this is very, very obviously not okay. And the other point is this, obviously, so the moral aspect, that it hurts actually like good people like Riley. And the second thing is it has like an excessive amount of data collection involved. So install, I wouldn't even say at your own risk, but like at your own discretion. I tested it definitely works, and it allows you to import ROMs, which I assume wouldn't work if it was like against Apple's guidelines. So I'm very positive that once Riley potentially uploads his own apps, and once we have like stuff, for example, like the Alt Store as an alternative app store on iOS, then I'm pretty sure that this stuff will just work just like this currently does, which is amazing. Now, Apple's guidelines do say that everything that is offered inside that retro emulator should need to be like licensed and need to have like the actual like permission of the developer, but this doesn't even have its own like store or anything. So I highly suspect that if this can get away with it, then I'm really sure that Riley could get away with it. And I kind of hope that he makes this like a $10 application and just makes a ton of bank with it, because well, he might not be interested in like porting GBA for iOS, but maybe like the Delta emulator that he's been working on for quite a while, and he definitely would be getting my money. So fully featured, you can insert your own Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color ROMs. It works really well. It has all the stuff, like I even tested it out with my DualSense controller for my PS5. So everything that worked in GBA for iOS does currently work with iGBA. I would just say, if you install it, use it. If you are okay with the data collection, and then once there's like a more official solution, please consider giving that actually your money, because in my opinion that is infinitely more deserving of it. Basically the reviewers, the 95 Mac had the same thought that I did, right? Maybe there could be like an oversight from the people reviewing the app, but it seems like loading the ROM just from the Files app seems to apparently not be an issue, which kind of makes sense when you consider like most of the legal precedents regarding emulators, which is that emulating an app or a game and stuff, or even like an operating system, is not actually the problem. It's how you get the actual code to the game, the app, the operating system. And when it comes to the actual code of an emulator, the only like requirement for that code is that it has to be like in-house reverse engineered, right? Which is the case for like GBA for iOS. It cannot be just stolen code that allows you to run like a file designed for an older operating system or another piece of hardware. It basically, you have to look at that old OS, look at that specific piece of hardware, and write like a compatibility layer that is designed for the new hardware that you're targeting. You cannot just basically copy paste elements of the Game Boy's like firmware. You cannot just copy like APIs that were designed for it. You have to rewrite of it basically as much as possible. Some stuff will probably be okay even if it's like copy pasted, because there's probably not much alternative to that. But yeah, so GBA for iOS, that project is actually super duper clean. I wouldn't like, have been some problems with stuff like Citra and Yuzu, which are 3DS and Nintendo Switch emulators respectively, but those problems also didn't come from stuff like was it like reverse engineered or not. The problem was that the developers sometimes really encouraged you to like download games that had been like just like leaked and hacked from the Switch, and Nintendo really didn't like that. And then they had like Patreon projects that made them a lot of money while they kept advertising like, oh, like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom just got cracked 2 weeks before actual release, and we just launched an update that supports that. Which, I mean, like Ryujing sometimes does the same, but maybe Ryujing is too small to actually get the same kind of attention. So I just really wanted to point out that this is like, if you can get GBA for iOS, actually use GBA for iOS and support the original developers. If Riley doesn't launch like an app officially on the App Store, maybe he'll just want to do like his own alt store thing. At that point, I would probably like subscribe to him for like Patreon or something, so that I could keep using like forks of GBA for iOS without like moral quandary. It's quite an interesting development. Now, this is actually something where I'm a huge fan of the Digital Markets app, because it is now the reason that we have gotten cloud gaming apps. Now we have also gotten like retro game emulators, and we are about to get like proper browsers that have engines beyond WebKit. Now that you can choose to use them or not, but those were three things that I've always believed should be on iOS in some form or another. I'm somebody who doesn't support like full-on site loading or even alternative marketplaces. I always wanted like some guidelines that prevent Apple from preventing developers from putting more interesting, newer applications on the App Store. And those were three examples that I would always give. Well, I would always give the first two, which are like proper cloud gaming apps and emulators, but like alternative browsers is always something that I could acknowledge was always missing, right? I love WebKit. I will most likely for 99% of the time continue using WebKit-based browsers on iOS. But given that some websites these days are really built with Chrome in mind, especially things like the YouTube Studio app, which I use, I kind of would be happy to get like a Chromium-based browser as well. What I do not like about the DMA is that it enforces this sort of like pseudo site loading with alternative marketplaces. I've always advocated that it would be way better if they just mandated Apple drop like the 30% App Store commission from like 30% to 20, maybe their 15% commission to like 10 or 12 for smaller developers. I don't think that below 10% makes any sense, given that Apple has to handle like processing, they have to like their servers up, they have to handle like payment processors, they have to pay people that review apps, they have to create their APIs every year, they have to test even like third-party apps internally, so that when they release a new like version of iOS, they make sure that they don't accidentally brick like Facebook, WhatsApp, and all that stuff simultaneously, because that would bring them both into legal trouble, but also just like get a big blowback from users. So this is like a little bit of extra sauce on my part when it comes to those kinds of news. But yeah, so Game Boy Emulator is the first basically official emulator for retro game systems that we now have on the App Store with the new App Store rules. I'm really glad that I was right, at least according to this application, that you would be able to import your own ROMs into this. Again, the way you get actually to that ROM is another legal question, but this is a question that honestly I don't care about. Like, I'm fine with emulating Pokemon Emerald into perpetuity. It's one of my most played games ever, and I would give Nintendo my money if they allowed me to pay for it on the Switch or somewhere else. I don't plan on, even if there was like a Ryujinx on iOS or something like that, I wouldn't emulate Switch stuff on there. I do play around with like Ryujinx on my Mac, but it's mostly more like benchmarking stuff and like 3DS emulation, maybe at some point. Because especially now that the 3DS like App Store has actually been closed. So again, a lot of stuff to consider. I'm really looking forward to see how it evolves. I really hope that Apple doesn't go back on allowing you to import your own ROMs, and I do hope to get more official solutions from actual like the developers behind open source projects like GBA for iOS, but I also know that similar things exist for like the PS1, the PS2, which I would also like to see emulators for on iOS. And basically, again, the current one, iGBA, use it at your own discretion. So this was quite a lot for the beginning, which the beginning is now 40 minutes, which is quite insane for me. Now, there is one big thing that is left, and that big thing is a continuation of an old thing, and an old thing that I've referred to time and time again while I was covering other things on this channel, and that is the Snapdragon X Elite. The Snapdragon X Elite is a very interesting processor because it's in many ways hyper interesting. It's definitely the most advanced like consumer ARM processor for Windows devices, right? I mean, like technically the M series chips, you can use it for Windows, but you would use it in like parallels in a virtual machine, or maybe through some kind of compatibility layer. But you have to go basically from Mac OS or Linux to some kind of Windows application or something like that. This is from the ground up optimized for Windows on ARM. I really hope that Windows 12 on ARM will be much better than everything we've seen before from Windows. Part of that has to do with like going back to the Windows RT days. Microsoft has not given Windows ARM systems the love that they deserve. There's also the question is, even if this is a fantastic processor, how good is like your translation, your emulation? How much actual native support do you get? What is the battery impact if you are going through a translation or an emulation layer? So there is a lot to consider that we will see once devices with the Snapdragon X Elite launches, and then once Windows 12 launches, because this is also a longer standing rumors that we'll get like an AI focused new Windows, and that one will be Windows 12, and it will probably require chips with significant basically onboard AI capabilities, which will include things like the Snapdragon X Elite. But it's just fascinating to see that it's coming out while we're switching from M3 to M4, while Apple is introducing their own AI stuff, while we're switching from Windows 11 to Windows 12, while Microsoft is finally sort of confident in their emulation and translation stuff, but while we also hope to be getting support from like third-party developers to actually create native Windows on ARM applications. And basically right now, the only thing we can actually go through are a little bit more benchmarks. This kind of my problem, because benchmarks don't actually reflect your like regular user experience. I think multi-core benchmarks are particularly often worthless when it comes to like understanding how your basic system like interacts, how fast it is, how smooth it is. But this is what we are working with, right? And before we can see exactly what M4 has to offer, we now have more data, at least for the M3, with the Snapdragon X Elite. Now, first up front, the Snapdragon X Elite is a 12-core processor. All 12 cores are Orion cores. Those are the latest cores from Qualcomm, or to be honest, they are part of their new generation of cores. Those will also be the cores powering the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 later this year, and a big part of the discrepancy between like the Snapdragon 8 series and the X Elite is that the 8 series is of course comprised by a lot of efficiency cores, while this is just 12 cores. Now I could call them performance cores, but those are just the Orion cores. And this is based on N4P, so a 4 nanometer by TSMC, which puts it in line with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, while the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 later this year will very likely be based on N3E, which is TSMC's second generation node, 3 nanometer node, which would put it more in line with the M4, while right now we're basically getting a really late launch for a 4 nanometer process. But it is what it is. That always happens. If you have like a really new design, you usually launch it a little later in like the node cycle, unless you're Apple, and then you launch the M1 and the A14 basically as the very first 5 nanometer chips, but not everyone can be as lucky. So we have gotten some initial benchmarks for the Snapdragon X Elite basically when it was presented late last year, and now we have gotten more. I've just chosen Tom's Hardware. They had 3 systems there. Snapdragon X Elite, they have like sub versions. One is like X1E 80100, and then basically like a 4 if it's, I suppose, the more powerful version. And then they had like different RAM configurations, and they tested like different stuff with it. What I did find interesting was that it was clocked at like 3.4 gigahertz for like for like the bint version, but then it went up to like 3.8 gigahertz. From everything that we were shown initially, it supposedly is a chip that goes up to 4.3 gigahertz. So I don't know if those are like multi-core clock speeds, or if this is actually like single core, like boost even for just a millisecond. It doesn't go higher than 3.8 gigahertz, because I would be surprised if from like showings where it had like supposedly lower performance at 4.3 gigahertz, now it's like as good or better at 3.8. That would be an insane uplift in instructions per clock. Or if those numbers are sort of like averaged for like multi-core stuff. Again, I cannot tell you that. But it seems like obviously similar to how it's pretty common with especially Intel and AMD. If you have a more bint version, if you have a more like efficiency optimized like laptop or something like that, then it will run at a lower clock speed. So 811, so the 0100 version is the bint version, while the 84100, that is the one that goes up to 3.8 gigahertz. Again, will they have something that clocks even higher? I don't know. When they originally showed it off, they showed it off in like 22 watt versions and 83 watt versions, I believe. So I suppose this is kind of the continuation of that, but just with like official chip variants that are optimized for like different wattages. They've optimized the benchmarks because obviously when they originally showed it, they showed it versus M2, and then M3 came out and made that pretty much pointless, because now M3 has been like on the market for half a year and the X Elite still isn't out. The M3 will most likely be much more energy efficient on like average basis than the X Elite, not just from its newer node, but also because it has like a mix of performance and efficiency cores, while this is just efficiency cores. And I wanted to actually start with this, the 15,610 Geekbench 6 multi-threaded CPU performance result versus 12,154 on the M3 chip. And this benchmark is the reason why when you actually like type in X Elite on Google and go into news, you'll find a lot of stuff that says like Microsoft's believes X Elite will like crush M3, or new benchmarks show X Elite defeating the M3. Well, there's a little bit of nuance to that. The first nuance, now I will probably, admit one thing. It's very likely that there will be Snapdragon X Elite laptops that cost as much as the M3 MacBook Air, or even lower, right? However, that is not how you compare processors, because obviously the final price of a product is a lot dependent on like, well, other things about the actual device, and then the overall margin that the hardware manufacturer wants to collect on that sale. While if you just compare processors, you usually compare them on two things, which is performance and efficiency, or like performance and power consumption, and those two also give you like performance per watt, because you before that you had the performance and you have the watts, so now you can actually calculate efficiency. Now, and this is where we get into like crazy territory, because the M3 is like Apple's like 10, maybe 15 watt processor, really varies from benchmark to benchmark, really varies if it goes all the way up to like it's a 4 gigahertz clock speed, or maybe just stays a little bit below, really varies between like, are you utilizing actually like all 8 cores, between like 4 performance and 4 efficiency cores to their max, like is it more like a Geekbench like task, which is a little faster, is it more like Cinebench, which is a little bit more like prolonged testing, is it actually a test that is very much optimized to like leverage every single transistor, or does it have a lot more to do with like bandwidth or something like that? So yeah, the M3 is basically a super duper efficient, super duper small in comparison to a lot of like devices that come anywhere close, it's single core performance processor. It's designed to even fit into like tablets that are completely passively cooled and stuff like that. And here it is getting compared to the Snapdragon X Elite, that at best we were shown would be an efficiency devices that are like 22 watts focused. And supposedly, I would believe that this is a benchmark more likely to show the X1E8400, because I have no idea why Qualcomm would show like the lower clocked versions. And originally, the higher clocked versions of Qualcomm were shown to be like in 83 watt devices. Now, if we actually go to like some data that we have, and this is here, the benchmarks for Geekbench 6 for Macs. This is where you will find around the X Elite result, right? Like around 15,000. And guess what? Which processor you can find here? Well, that is the M3 Pro. And that has always been the point. The Snapdragon X Elite, probably in wattage, will sit somewhere between the M3 Pro and the M3 Max. It is not a chip that is in any way competing with the base M3. Where is even the base M3 here in terms of multitasking? Here it is. It's around 12,000 points, right? And this is where, to me, it gets like really, really disingenuous, because M3 is Apple's base Apple Silicon chip for the new generation. It is more optimized for the MacBook Air and the iPad. I mean, sure, you could get it to pretty crazy wattages if you use stuff like Cinebench, or even like a very demanding like Final Cut Pro edit or something like that. Sure, then it will benefit from something like active cooling. I would argue this is more to do with the abysmal amount of passive cooling in the MacBook Air, and that if the MacBook Air had like just a larger heatsink inside, it probably wouldn't need active cooling. But yeah, it is what it is right now. The M3 is around 12,000 points in Geekbench. And then of course people would be like, well, now the X Elite beats it, unless you consider actual power consumption. As I said, originally they said for like the two variants that they tested initially, they were like 22 and 83 wattage, and I found actually a little bit of data on that stuff, which this is based on Handbrake power consumption, so it I don't know if it I believe it tends to be a little bit higher than something like Geekbench, but a little bit lower than something like Cinebench. I believe this comes from slightly different utilization of the CPU, right? And the M3 Pro consumed around 30 watts here, which would be obviously a little higher than the 22 and 83 watts does not actually mean that this is exactly how much the X Elite used in those laptops. Again, we don't have any actual like hard data on power consumption. The metric of like 22 or 83 watts has actually more to do with like more the average power envelope that the laptop was designed for. The actual power consumption can be higher or lower depending on how like the fans are tuned, depending what like the battery target is. So the M3 Pro coming out at around 30 watts here probably is very, very comparable to the 22 watt version, definitely not to the 83 watt version. This is actually where we would find the M3 Max, which has a peak power consumption for its CPU and Handbrake of around 50 watts. But then again, you can also argue that maybe that 83 watt version is just like optimized for like 60 watts, but is actually also like so well cooled that it does like 60 watts, but like at basically very, very little ambient noise or something like that. So again, I cannot actually give you like hard data on power consumption of the X Elite. That will remain basically a mystery until we get like production ready X Elite products. But I just wanted to give you like, this is the ballpark. I saw like data that goes like to the like mid 20 watt range on the M3 Pro, and I saw data even closer to like 60 watts for the M3 Max, which actually would show like also really good scaling between those processors. And yeah, but when you actually look at like the base M3 chip, given that like M1 is like 11 watts, M2 is like 15 watts, I saw different M3 tests ranging from like 12 watts to like 17 watts. So it will be substantially lower than even like the most efficient, most low clocked version of the X Elite. This the efficiency advantage for the Apple Silicon processors is basically completely here unbeaten. Now this is just efficiency comparison for Apple Silicon, but it's just interesting. This is like what our usage, again, the devices are also different, so I wouldn't put too much stock in it, but this is an interesting like Ars Technica result here. If we actually look at single core result, then we'll find something like where is it? Where did they have like more newer single core results? I believe it was like in the 2800 range, but I don't want to say anything wrong here. Now they do have some power consumption graphs here, showing the X Elite basically like in single threaded using up to 12 watts, but achieving its greatest results at around 7 watts. Apple Silicon will do a lot of great like single core results at around 5 watts, unless you're using like a Geekervan result, then it probably it's like at 50 watts or something like bullshit like that. Yeah, and this is why those graphs, by the way, that they're showing are comparing it to Intel Core Ultra and AMD Ryzen chips. Obviously, this is like Meteor Lake. Meteor Lake was quite disappointing as a launch. It's like a mixture of Intel 4 node and TSMC 5 nanometer, TSMC 6 nanometer, and then Ryzen 9 7940HS is a 4 nanometer APU by AMD. So you can actually see that at first it performs like way better than Intel Core, but it just has like a lower peak performance output unless you really push it to like a high degree. And when you actually see where the Snapdragon X Elite reaches its peak like multi-core performance, they say it's around 40 watts. You can actually find like what I said with like the 22 watts. This is where it probably is like the most advantageous to put, because you get like most of the performance that you want, but it's a substantially lower power consumption. You probably again could push it even more, but then like it very small gains. So if you have a system that is like 50 watts, this is where you're probably seeing very much like diminishing returns even from 40 or 30 watts, and you probably would want to push the X Elite somewhere between like 25 to 35 watts to get like a mix of both best performance and best efficiency. Yeah, so again, the competition here is Intel and AMD, but it's not even like technically there's like a newer AMD Ryzen chip, but it's barely any better. It's the 8940HS, and we are waiting for Arrow Lake processors. Again, Meteor Lake is completely irrelevant, I would argue, in the broader discussion. If somebody buys like Intel laptops because they just like the brand more, or because manufacturers didn't actually make enough AMD chips, I highly doubt that person would suddenly choose the Snapdragon X Elite and deal with all the issues with like Windows on ARM having a much smaller selection of natively developed apps for Windows on ARM. Again, I don't want to like poo-poo this too much. It seems to be definitely more efficient than what is currently on the market. So that's good on the Windows on ARM front. But the fact that they aren't actually putting M2 even on those graphs, much less M3, kind of shows you a little bit what you can expect. There's a reason why this is like a test between like the multi-core of the M3 versus the X Elite, given that the multi-core graph here shows that it's like 42 watts or something like that, and we just saw that the peak power consumption of the M3 Pro, which produces about the same or slightly higher multi-core results, is more in the 25 to 30 watt range. It's kind of actually interesting, right? I would argue that this is definitely speaks to this being like 20% around more efficient, maybe more than that, than the X Elite, which is kind of forgivable given that this is on 3 nanometer, while the X Elite is on 4 nanometer, but it's kind of also not excusable because M4 is just around the corner, and then the X Elite, we would have to wait probably another year before we get like a 3 nanometer based version. And then Apple will be closer to 2 nanometer. So it seems like the X Elite is launching a little bit out of date. And then if you actually want to compare it with base M series chips, this is where you'll find like them being far less power hungry, even in relation to how many cores they have, right? There's also like an interesting Reddit stuff that breaks it all down with like power consumption stuff. I can recommend you go into that. We've covered a lot of that, but not in as much detail. Again, they put the M3 Pro Max power consumption here at around for the CPU at 29 watts and the 17 watts on the GPU, which would be interesting to see what the power consumption for the X Elite GPU is and what like the power consumption is for both the combined CPU and GPU stuff. This is where you would probably want to get like something like that reference 80 multi-watt design if you actually want to maximize both CPU and GPU simultaneously. But again, I cannot speak to that while we don't actually have like more benchmarks, actual power consumption breakdowns. Now, before I get into something that discredits some of this a little bit, I would want to like show you some good stuff about the X Elite. And that is, you will find that for Geekbench 6.2, there's actually now newer versions of Geekbench 6. Maybe something changes there as well. They're saying this is where it will reach around 2750 to 2800 in terms of single core. And then in terms of multi-core, this is where it will reach like 14.2 versus 14.4. So this is the like the lower clock 3.4 gigahertz version. While if you go all the way up with like the X Elite X1E84100 that is paired at, that is clocked at 3.8 gigahertz, this is where you'll get like 2850 to 2900. Now, by instruction per clock ratings, this is actually quite good. There is one small problem here though, and that is if you actually look at the Geekbench results for in terms of single core, the Macs do perform higher. There's a question of what the actual like power consumption will be when it comes to single core. Again, multi-core, this is for, again, the much higher power consumption version than this one. So this will probably be the more realistic competitor to M3 Pro. This would be more of a competitor to M3 Max. And when we actually look at multi-core performance, you'll find that M3 Max obviously is like much higher in terms of multi-core performance, and around 21,000 versus like 15,000. And then in terms of like single core, this is where Max reached like around 1,100 to 3,200. So definitely it won't beat the M3 generation, but it could come pretty close. The only thing that really stands out though is that the only benchmark that we have gotten thus far that actually like seems to show off, and this seems to be like the lower clocked version of 3.42 gigahertz, does show a noticeably lower single core result at around 2400. So this is obviously a lot of data at one time, and I apologize for that. But yeah, so those are basically best case scenario numbers. That would actually line up, in my opinion, very much to what they've also done with like the Snapdragon 8 processors, where you can get like close to 10% too much performance, like in like reference benchmarks versus actual like production ready devices. Again, it will depend on maybe if like in an active cooling scenario, maybe the X Elite comes closer to its reference devices than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 does, like from its reference smartphone to actual production ready smartphones. But I just wouldn't bet on that, right? Now, in terms of other benchmarks here, I actually, I believe I for some reason closed that. Blender CPU M3 Apple. Wait, but no, that doesn't even make sense because I don't know what Blender test they actually ran here, right? Blender, they just say CPU. If I do Command F and I look for Blender, in the second match, it's just, yeah, it doesn't even say like which one it runs, so it doesn't really make sense to look at Blender. I'll just look into 3D Mark. So 3D Mark obviously being like a GPU test. I don't know why I closed this. I had that somewhere open. Maybe I put it in Chrome and forgot it. I know that the Chrome I now have open is just for YouTube Studios. So they use their I just close anything that I don't need. So they used like Wildlife Extreme, And we actually have a 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme test. This is for the base M3 processor, and it gives you like a median of 80 to 86, while this gave you how much? This gives you, oh, they expressed it in frames per second, which is 41.9 to 44. Did they gave like a, wait, why do they not have like a frame number? Why is there like no, like, this is very weird. Why is there like no GFX bench, which I know they love? Is it because they were actually losing to a fully enabled M2 and GFX bench? Like 3D Mark. I know that I have found like something with 3D Mark M3 Apple. Tried to prepare as much as I could yesterday, but I guess some of it was lost while I was updating my Mac. Test system performance, synthetic graphics task. Yeah, so they don't actually give you like frame rate for a 3D Mark Wildlife. Just keep in comparison that it's apparently 8300. GFX bench, which is not the GFX bench we actually want. Damn it. Rise of the Tomb Raider. Total War. Wait, why don't they not have like Wildlife? I thought they did. The first being 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme subset. Oh, I'm sorry. The 3D Mark Wildlife is like the test that we don't have the FPS for. Damn it. Why did I delete my extra tabs? So I'm now looking for what? Yeah, I would love to see like some 3D Mark like in frame rate, I guess, for like the M3. I'll just 3D Mark M3 Wildlife Extreme FPS. Maybe that will show something. That's the M3 Max. Do we have the base M3 processor for this? Comparison Wildmark. Oh, do they have like the results actually on the website? I didn't know they shared those. Graphics card. How do I find something on here? Benchmarks. No, this will probably like tell me to download something, right? Compare GPUs. So if I switch to like M3, will it show me something? If I go to like M3 Pro, if I go to MacBook, damn it. I don't even know what I had open yesterday that actually showed me like a comparison for this. How could I lose this? So Blender, again, they don't give you actual result. So let's then just look Cinebench M3 results. So Cinebench 2024 multi-core on M3 versus the X Elite. Where is it? Really, multi-core is that much higher versus this one. So it could be just that also Cinebench is also not very optimized. Is that the same version? Yes, Cinebench 2024. It's like weird. Like really, the 9900 KS only gives you that much multi-core performance? That's actually quite interesting. How much does Apple product comparison is actually cool. No, that's not what I was looking for. M3 lineup, Geekbench 6 and Cinebench. So M3 and Cinebench, this is R23, so that's not the same, unfortunately. Damn it. Cinebench 2024. So where will we find the M3? The M3 Max in single core, which should be pretty similar, is 144 versus this is 121 to 123, 126 to 128. So the single core performance on Apple Silicon definitely seems to be better. Guys, this has somehow become just a learning thing for me, just as has been for you. And then when we look at M2, M1, M2, you'll actually find that the single core is already quite up there. And yeah, given how low the multi-core results for M1 and M2 are, I wouldn't actually like put it past the M3 being just 600 something. But when you look into why is there no M3 Pro? M3 Max, M2 Pro, should be somewhere here. Oh man, the 1490. So Cinebench 2024, M3 Pro. Yeah, so those results are actually true that we get on like CPU Monkey. That's actually really good. So in comparison to this, you can find this is where it got like 1140 to 1200. So you can once again see that the multi-core results, similar to how Geekbench gives us both 1500, around 15,000 for the M3 Pro and the X Elite, the higher clocked X Elite. You'll find that this one gets close to the performance of the X Elite when it comes to multi-core. And then the only question is like how much faster is the M3 Max and what is the power consumption penalty there. If you actually look at the tests here, what else do they test beyond like, so they test like Cinebench single core. You will find the M3 Pro much faster in terms of single core, at least like 10% difference, about even on multi-threaded performance. This is like older test. We don't have that data here. So this is older Geekbench as well. Again, I've also pointed out how Geekbench 6 scales. Again, this is actually like pretty insane. This is one test that we have for the Snapdragon X Elite where it had like 3200. That one is clocked at 4.25 gigahertz. That would be quite high. I don't know what that power consumption there would be like. Maybe they cooled it with like liquid nitrogen or something like that. But once you compare it to like the 14th gen processors that are completely overclocked here, it's actually quite good considering how much more efficient all of this is. iGPU, this is FP32 performance. So this is like basically like raw teraflops in terms of compute. Pretty meaningless metric because it doesn't fully like it scales differently from architecture to architecture. Oh, and this is like passmark. Do they have like passmark here? They had PC mark. Okay, so that's a little different, unfortunately. So that just leaves like, again, like Blender. I don't know which Blender they used, and then like they had like games running through on Windows translation layer, which like Redout, Control, Baldur's Gate 3. They had hit like 30 FPS in most of them. Some got a little higher, like Control going to 40 FPS on low settings. We like this is through emulation. I don't know if they mean like emulation or translation, similar to what like Rosetta is doing on macOS for like x86 application. But yeah, there definitely will be better performance on like proper optimized applications. So PC Mark. Is there a PC Mark actually for Apple Silicon? I didn't actually look that up before. PC Mark M3 MacBook. Priced, yeah, MacBook Pro. PC Mark. Benchmark. Sorry guys, this has turned into a learning lesson for me as well. This is all Passmark. I don't know how that actually compares to like this one. I should be really looking up all those benchmarks and creating like a table for all the data. But I'll probably do that offline so I don't have to like rattle your nerves too much. Yeah, so my only question is like M3 Wildlife Extreme FPS. Why can't I just find this? Wildlife Extremes F graphics times 167. So I would have to like divide by 167 from like 8300. 8300, which would be an FPS range of 49. Okay, that actually makes sense, because when you look at this, you will find that Wildlife Extreme on the lower version had like 37 to 38.5, and this one has 41.9 to 44. Given that early tests showed that it was around the M2 range when it comes to GPU performance, actually having the M3 being like 10-15% faster makes a lot of sense. And then the only question is like, do we have like results for that for M3 Pro, for example? And the M3, because the M2 Pro has like 12,900 and 77 FPS, and the M3 Pro has 14,587 FPS. So this was actually when a lot of people were worried that the M3 Pro, technically having less cores than the M2 Pro, would like really negatively affect its GPU performance, but it did not. So, and you can actually find this is like the 14, this is the 14 core version, right? So this is the bint version, right? And then, yeah, it had like 12,000. And if we go like 12,000 divided by 167, yeah, this is when we get to like 72 FPS. Yeah, so we figured it out. I apologize for taking longer. So I think that I'll start wrapping it up with this. We definitely got through a lot of data, and I learned a lot myself. I apologize for the stream getting a little slower by the end, because I didn't want to misrepresent anything about the data that we have. But yeah, the amount of data that we have is yet a little limited, but it's looking pretty good in terms of single core for the X Elite. Multi-core, again, depends heavily on how much performance it actually uses while hitting those multi-core results. And I will obviously also see into those other benchmarks down the road. We'll probably also be hitting like more final production ready products. So please let me know what you actually like find in that regard, if maybe the actual benchmarks and production ready products are much lower, because again, that is kind of almost always the case for like Qualcomm products. We saw that with multiple generations of the Snapdragon 8 products. Let's see if that will be similarly correct for the X Elite. Yeah, so whenever I speak next time on the X Elite, I'll be even better prepared, and I hope by that time we'll also have like more comprehensive AI benchmarks that are more cross-platform comparable. Beyond that, we've talked also about, of course, the M4 coming later this year, so that will be probably even like a more relevant competitor to the X Elite than the M3. We'll also see how the M4 upgrades like AI capabilities on the M3, because this seems to be one area where the X Elite most likely will win in its first iteration versus the M3, probably by like 20% or something like that. In GPU, definitely not a really high performer, definitely not in terms of performance versus anything that it's like comparable to in wattage. That is also very important, because the M3 seems to beat it in like GPU performance, but then in terms of wattage, the X Elite is more tuned for devices that are more similar to like the M3 Pro MacBook Pro, but then it probably will also be a lot cheaper than an M3 Pro based MacBook Pro. So take it as you will, and take it once there are actually production ready devices. As I've shown, there's some early benchmark that show it being quite below what they're showing, at least in terms of single core performance, but we'll see. And the last piece of a rumor that we have talked about today, where I've already closed the tab, was that there are now retro game emulators coming to the App Store. We got our first one, which is basically a cheap knockoff or just a fork of the open source GBA for iOS project, but it seems to work, and it seems to allow you to input your own ROMs. So if you feel like using it, test it out, and then maybe wait for a more official version, quote unquote. So I'll wrap it up as is for today. We'll look into more stuff, anything that is like Apple or tech in general, that is very interesting to me over the next week. I'll probably be doing 2 or 3 streams. Maybe I'll make a smaller video depending on my time. So I really like putting out the content. I really appreciate all your support. Like the last couple of videos have performed pretty well. So if you want to support this channel more, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting, and of course, if you want to support this channel directly, you can find my Patreon link in the description of this channel. While I'm live, you can send a super chat or a super sticker, and of course, when a video has already been uploaded, you can send a super thanks, I believe it's called. I always forget somehow. So with all this, thank you so much for your support. Please let me know either in the comments or on Twitter. Most of you choose Twitter, what you would like to see me comment on next, or maybe I had some grave mistakes that you would like to see corrected. Regardless of all that, thank you so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.